Here's a picture of Madame Blavatsky as a young woman, and the more familiar face of Madame Blavatsky, the grandmother of the New Age movement, the infamous grandmother of the New Age movement. The chief theorist of the Theosophical Society, an esoteric movement established in 1875 in New York and developed in Europe, America, and India. Blavatsky was an unconventional expatriate Russian from the minor nobility, a voracious reader, a prolific writer on esoteric themes, and a very unusual character. Her major works are Isis Unveiled of 1877, of 2 volumes of around 600 pages each, and her masterwork, The Secret Doctrine, of 1888, again 2 volumes of about 600 pages, and 14 volumes of collected writings, including articles for newspapers and magazines, short stories, and personal correspondence. Although they find their fullest expression in 1888 with the publication of The Secret Doctrine, a lot of Blavatsky's ideas about Qabbalah are actually articulated already in Isis Unveiled more than a decade earlier, and this is important when we come to contextualize Blavatsky's ideas. In addition to Qabbalah, Theosophy syncretized a range of sources including Neo-Hindu and Buddhist thought, spiritualism, contemporary scientific theories, and modern occultism. Theosophists were drawn largely from the professional and upper classes, especially intellectuals and creative thinkers, religious liberals, scientists with an interest in spirituality, feminists, and anybody with a penchant for the unconventional and the unusual. Lots of people ask me if the Theosophical Society still exists. Well, yes, it does, although it's much smaller and less influential today. Its historical significance lies in the fact that it spawned various offshoot movements that have been highly influential in the development of the New Age movement and present-day alternative spiritualities. Its study also provides insights into some of the intellectual and cultural changes that were occurring at the end of the 19th century in Europe, America, and India. Recently, there's been some academic work on the various forms of occultist Qabbalah, including the Kabbalistic teachings of the 19th century Freemasons, and Bartus has written on the use of Theosophical Qabbalah by Naphtali Herz Imber and the Jewish Theosophist A.D. Ezekiel. But as far as I know, the only person to deal specifically with Blavatsky and Qabbalah is Marco Passi, and Passi highlighted Theosophy's role in the creation and juxtaposition of the categories of East and West, with the Qabbalah placed ambiguously between the two. He thus highlighted the participation of Qabbalah in the definition of Eastern and Western esotericism by Blavatsky, which subsequently influenced the development of the present-day academic notion of Western esotericism. Brendan French's work on Blavatsky in the Russian Orthodox Church is also relevant because it touches on a branch of Blavatsky's chain of transmission, of which Qabbalah forms an integral part. And I'll say a little bit more about Passi and French in what follows. In the limited time frame of this presentation, I intend to approach the complexity of Blavatsky's relationship with Qabbalah through a close reading of one extract from The Secret Doctrine. Because this will be an ideational and a historical analysis rather than a literary one, I'm going to deal with different parts of the extract in a slightly different order to that in which Blavatsky wrote them, since it will make more sense that way. And I'm going to highlight the different sections as I go. I'm going to offer some historical contextualization for Blavatsky's Qabbalah and show that it was part of her definition of and solution for the Victorian crisis. As we know, the late 19th century was a time of colonial expansion, of increasing global trade in goods and ideas, and the ascent of science. As well as being a world preoccupied with evolution, there was also significant cultural pessimism. Historians initially conceived of the Victorian crisis of faith as a widespread loss of religious belief after 1859, but now understand it in a more nuanced way as including various types of crises. In Blavatsky's definition of the crisis, monotheism and materialism were blamed for the intellectual and spiritual problems of the period. She equated the Kabbalistic doctrine of Ein Sof with the Neo-Vedantic concept of Parabrahman, and offered the ensuing emanationist cosmogony as part of an anti-monotheist and anti-materialist polemic. I'm going to discuss these polemics in some of their wider context, namely contemporary theories about the evolution of monotheism, the 19th century Hindu Renaissance, and the rise of scientific naturalism. I argue that the overall theme in all of this is the use of Qabbalah by Blavatsky for anti-authoritarian ends. Blavatsky used Qabbalah generally and the notion of Ein Sof in particular to rail against the authority of scientists, academics, and clergy while setting herself up as a privileged new authority. This suggests that, at least for Blavatsky, the Victorian crisis was as much a crisis of authority as of anything else. Hang on a minute. Okay. Here's a passage from The Secret Doctrine. Unless the Qabbalah, or what is left of it, is read by the light of the Eastern esoteric philosophy, its study leads only to the discovery that, on the lines traced by exoteric Judaism and Christianity, the monotheism of both is nothing more exalted than ancient astrology, now vindicated by modern astronomy. The Kabbalists never cease to repeat that primal intelligence can never be understood, hence the Ein Sof, the unknowable, the unnameable, which, as it could not be made manifest, was conceived to emanate manifesting powers. It is then with its emanations alone that human intellect has to and can deal. Christian theology, having rejected the doctrine of emanations and replaced them with direct conscious creations of angels and the rest out of nothing, now finds itself hopelessly stranded between supernaturalism, or miracle, and materialism. An extra-cosmic God is fatal to philosophy. An intracosmic deity, i.e. spirit and matter inseparable from each other, is a philosophical necessity. Separate them, and that which is left is a gross superstition under a mask of emotionalism. This is a very rich passage, and I'd like to start by elaborating a little on Blavatsky's beliefs about why the Qabbalah, in its present form, is incomplete. This involves looking at some aspects of Blavatsky's version of the chain of transmission of the secret doctrine, that is, her version of the Prisca Theologia of the Renaissance Christian Kabbalists. Blavatsky's emphasis on the misuse of power in the transmission of Qabbalah, especially by the Church Fathers and the Catholic clergy, is consistent with the challenges to ecclesiastical authority that were gaining momentum towards the end of the 19th century. For Blavatsky, the term Qabbalah designated a branch of the secret doctrine, the pristine and perennial wisdom tradition that had been transmitted by the Atlanteans to the Aryans. Subsequently, the Qabbalah had been transmitted by various groups at different points in history, but had become corrupted along the way. Groups or persons that were believed to have received a version of the secret doctrine in its Kabbalistic form included Moses, the Chaldeans, the Jews in general, but Shimon Bar Yochai in particular, the Essenes, Jesus, St. John, and the Gnostics. This Kabbalistic wisdom was connected both with Egypt and with ancient India. Blavatsky spoke of two branches of the Qabbalah, the Eastern Aryan branch, which was the closest to the original secret doctrine, and the Chaldeo-Jewish branch, which was relatively more corrupted. The Chaldeo-Jewish branch began with Moses, who was said to have been an Egyptian priest. The Qabbalah was initially corrupted because of his personal ambition, when the tribal and phallic deity Jehovah was incorrectly elevated as the one true God. This is what Blavatsky meant when she said that monotheism was no better than the worship of the heavenly bodies. And interestingly, this notion of a phallic Jehovah was not new to Blavatsky. It was in the style of the late 19th century erotic writer Edward Sellon, as shown by Jocelyn Godwin in his Theosophical Enlightenment. Returning to Blavatsky's chain of transmission, subsequent to Moses, both Christians and Jews had been guilty of further monotheistic distortions, despite having received the Kabbalistic wisdom through various channels. The Jews were supposed to have received the esoteric knowledge from both Egypt and ancient India and Chaldean wisdom during the Babylonian captivity. Blavatsky equated the Pharisees with the Egyptian therapeuti and said that the Essenes, also of Egyptian origin, were the teachers of Jesus. Jesus was a Kabbalist, by the way, who had passed the earlier years of his life in Egypt. She argued that the true form of early Christianity was Gnosticism, which was also associated with the Essenes. The New Testament was supposed to contain ancient Egyptian elements, and Blavatsky highlighted St. John's Gospel as particularly Gnostic, arguing that it was written in the mystery language of the Tanaim, the relic of Chaldeo-Egyptian wisdom, in other words, the Qabbalah. Blavatsky's somewhat contradictory statements on the value of the Zohar indicate that she believed that although it was by no means perfect, of all the Jewish works of Qabbalah, it was the least corrupt. Although the Church Fathers were condemned as monotheistic distorters, Blavatsky argued that Origen knew some Kabbalistic wisdom. For the sake of power, the Catholic Church had deliberately obfuscated Kabbalistic knowledge, although some esoteric teachings remain hidden in the Vatican. Marco Passi noted the irony of Blavatsky's turning of the Christian Kabbalist project on its head, that is, that she used Qabbalah to disprove Christianity rather than to prove it. But Brendan French correctly pointed out that scholars have consistently erred in assessing Blavatsky's response to Christianity because they overlooked the nuanced demarcation she regularly made between Christianity and churchianity, and there are a few examples of Blavatsky coming out quite strongly in favour of the Russian Orthodox Church, saying that in Russia the pure ideal of Christ was still preserved. Interestingly, she described England and America as pseudo-Christian countries. So that's some surprising words there from Blavatsky. And her self-understanding then was that she was upholding true Kabbalistic or esoteric Christianity in the face of the monotheistic distortions of the Catholics and the Protestants. This is why she refers to exoteric Judaism and exoteric Christianity, implying that there are esoteric varieties of each. Moving now to this notion of Eastern esotericism, this is precisely the concept that Marco Passi highlighted as a theosophical forerunner of the present-day academic definitions of Western esotericism. We've seen that Blavatsky gave the Kabbalah Eastern, and specifically Indian origins, and as Wouter Hanegraaff and others have shown, this notion of various types of Eastern origins for the Kabbalah was common in the 19th century and was not at all limited to occultist circles. It has a background in Romanticism, which from the second half of the 18th century saw in India a more holistic, spiritual and fully realized culture that was possessed of a primitive and fundamental spiritual knowledge that had been lost to the West, and that was a source of all wisdom and civilization. And Isaac Lubelsky has highlighted the work of academic Orientalists like William Jones and Friedrich Manz-Müller as direct influences on the Theosophical Society in this regard. But today, I want to focus on Blavatsky's own understanding of the Eastern esoteric philosophy as being identical with the Advaita Vedanta and what this means for her understanding of Kabbalah and monotheism. The Advaita or non-dual Vedanta that Blavatsky encountered in late 19th century India was in fact Neo-Vedanta. Interestingly, the term was current at the time and Blavatsky rejected it, denying that her Advaita Vedanta was Neo-Vedanta, since she found this offensive. Advaita Vedanta was, according to Blavatsky, obviously not a new creation, but the most ancient of Aryan traditions. Blavatsky's protestations notwithstanding, the concept of Hinduism was an invention of the 19th century Orientalists, and Neo-Vedanta was a modern form of Hindu thought that arose in the context of colonialism and in contact with European esoteric thought, as demonstrated by Elizabeth de Michaelis in her History of Modern Yoga. Neo-Vedanta became so popular in the 19th century that it came to be almost synonymous with the notion of Hinduism, a fact that's reflected in Blavatsky's writings. Blavatsky's most important Neo-Vedantic contact was with